I eventually became a good average pilot, got my license, and earned quite a nice living at it for some years. But the long, dreaded event came at last, the war between the states. Commercial traffic on the river ceased. I was out of a job. In an attempt to avoid being pressed into service by either side, I took passage on a boat north back to Hannibal. In fact, the Nebraska was the last passenger ship allowed up the Mississippi from St. Louis until after the war. But I did end up getting involved in the war in a small way for a short while. This is what happened. Missouri was a slave state, but it never seceded from the Union. That being so, the soldiers stationed in Hannibal, and there were many, were Union soldiers, and I had to keep away from them and out of sight if I didn't want to be pressed into service as a pilot on a warship, where I would be a target to get shot at by soldiers and snipers on the riverbanks. Not that I would have minded that so much, but I would rather volunteer than be drafted, and hadn't quite yet made up my mind which side I preferred to die for. Eventually, I did make a choice, and in the earliest summer days of the war, I slipped out of Hannibal one night with a friend to join an army detachment nearby. I was made second lieutenant of a company of 11 men who knew nothing about war. We didn't have a first lieutenant. I don't remember why now. It was so long ago. My friend Ben Tupper, who was 19 years old, 6 feet high, 3 feet wide, and some distance through, and just out of the infant school, he was made orderly sergeant. He had a hard time. When he was mounted and on the march, he used to go to sleep, and his horse would reach around and bite him on the leg. Then he would wake up and cry and curse and want to go home. He was town-bred and did not seem to have any correct idea of military discipline. If I commanded him to shut up, he would say, "Who was your slave last year?" One evening, I ordered him to ride out about 3 miles on picket duty to the beginning of a prairie. He said, "What? In the night? And them blame Union soldiers like to be prowling around there any time." So he wouldn't go. And the next morning, I ordered him again. He said, "In the rain?" He didn't go. Next day, I ordered him on picket duty once more. This time, he looked hurt. He said, "What? On Sunday? You must be a darn fool." Well, picketing might have been a very good thing, but I saw it was impracticable, so I dropped it from my military system. We had a good enough time camping out there in the fields and woods, until one day we heard that the invader was approaching, so we had to pack up and move, of course. And within 24 hours, they were coming again. So we moved again. Next day, they were after us once more. Well, we didn't like it much, but we moved rather than make trouble. I later found out it was U.S. Grant and his men who were chasing us around like that. A man I would come to know quite well under much different circumstances some decades later. Anyway, this went on for a week or 10 days more, and we saw considerable scenery. Then Ben Tupper lost patience. He said, "War ain't what it's cracked up to be. I'm going home if I can't ever get a chance to sit down a minute. Why do these people keep us a-humping around so? Blame their skins. Do they think this is an excursion?" Some of the other town boys got to grumbling. They complained that there was an insufficiency of umbrellas. So I sent around to the farmers and borrowed what I could. Then they complained that their Worcestershire sauce was out. There was mutiny and dissatisfaction all around, and of course, here come the enemy pestering us again. As much as 2 hours before breakfast, too, and nobody wanted to turn out, of course. This was a little too much. The whole command felt insulted. I detached one of my aides and sent him to the brigadier, and asked him to assign us a district where there wasn't so much bother going on. The history of our campaign was laid before him, but instead of being touched by it, what did he do? He sent back an indignant message and said, "You have had a dozen chances inside of 2 weeks to capture the enemy, and he is still at large." Well, we knew that. Feeling bad? Stay where you are this time, or I will court-martial and hang the whole lot of you. Well, I submitted this brutal message to my battalion and asked their advice. The orderly sergeant said, "If Tom Harris wants the enemy, let him come and get him. I ain't got any use for my share. And who's Tom Harris anyway, I'd like to know, that's putting on so many frills? Why, I knew him when he wasn't nothing but a darn telegraph operator. Gentlemen, you can do as you choose, but as for me, I've had enough of this sashaying around so that you can't get a chance to pray because the time's all required for cussing. So out goes my war paint, you hear me." The whole regiment said with one voice, "That's a talk for me." So there and then on the spot, my brigade disbanded itself and tramped off home, with me at the tail of it. I hung up my own sword and returned to the arts of peace. And there were some people who said I hadn't been absent from them yet. We were the first men that went into the Confederate Army in Missouri. And we were the first that went out of it, anywhere. The philosophers among those here assembled might reflect on the fact that it was only after I discharged myself from my military obligations that the Confederacy fell. General Grant, who was not one given to paying compliments gratuitously, later said frankly that if I had conducted the whole war, much bloodshed would have been spared. My brother Orion, 10 years older than me, the oldest of my siblings, had gone against the grain of most people in our part of Missouri and had advocated for the abolition of slavery and for unionism. In fact, Orion had tirelessly campaigned for Abraham Lincoln when that man was running for president. After Lincoln was elected to that office, my brother was rewarded for his efforts by his being appointed Secretary of the Nevada Territory, a brand new territory which Lincoln wanted to become a state soon, a desire that would be fulfilled just 3 years later in 1864. Orion had no money to get to his new situation in Nevada. I wanted to get away from the war, and I had money saved from my wages as a pilot. So I bought the tickets for both of us, and we headed west together. First on a steamboat up the Missouri River to St. Joseph, Missouri, and the rest of the way by stagecoach from there to Carson City, the capital of the Nevada Territory. It took us 20 days to make that journey on the stage. Today, it would only take a few days by train. During that long, bumpy ride, we saw Indians, desperados, jackrabbits, coyotes, lots of sagebrush and dust, and even the occasional Pony Express rider. We finally arrived in Carson City, travel-worn and covered with alkali dust. The first person we met when we got off the stage in Carson City was a man who went by the name of Jack Harris. Pacing by on horseback, he stopped to welcome us to the city. He barely got past saying hello when he begged leave to interrupt himself, saying, "I'll have to get you to excuse me for a minute. Yonder is that witness who swore I happened to rob a California coach. A piece of impertinent intermeddling, sir, for I'm not even acquainted with the man." I did notice that he didn't deny the charge, just took offense at the man being a busybody. Well, these two became acquainted immediately thereafter because Jack rode over to the stranger and began to rebuke the man with his six-shooter, and the stranger began to explain his point of view with another. The exchange of opposing viewpoints was brief. The impertinent meddler resumed repairing the hitching post he had been working on, and Harris rode away, nodding politely to Orion and me as he went by, with a bullet through one of his lungs and several more in his hips. that was our introduction to Carson City, and a pretty fitting one, too, for things like that happened pretty often there back then. Much of the time until statehood, Orion functioned as acting governor of Nevada, as Governor Nye was frequently out of the area, either in San Francisco, or Frisco as we called it, or back east somewhere. In fact, my brother could have continued in high office in Nevada after statehood, except for one thing. Of all times, he chose then to become a staunch prohibitionist, something the hard-drinking voters of Nevada were decidedly not in favor of. Orion's political career ended with a resounding thud. He never held public office again. There was something I noticed about Carson City that really struck me.